In the summer of 1999, 47 people were arrested in Tulia, Texas, on drug charges. They were convicted on the testimony of a single undercover officer. He wore no wire. He had no partner. No drugs were found in any of their homes on the day of the arrests. Not a gram. The town held a prayer meeting to celebrate. That is where this story begins. Not with the officer, with the prayer meeting, with the question of what a town full of ordinary church-going decent people had to already believe about their neighbors before zero evidence felt like enough. July in the Texas Panhandle does not ease in. The sun arrives before you are ready for it, and the heat it brings is the dry pressing kind that makes the asphalt go soft by noon and turns the dust on the road a pale, almost white color. Tulia sits midway between Amarillo and Lubbock, out in flat open country, where the land stretches in every direction until it simply runs out and dissolves into sky. Cotton fields, cattle pasture, a water tower with the town's name visible from 3 miles out. The wind in summer carries heat and fine grit that gets into the creases of everything. 5,000 people. A main street. A county courthouse built from pale stone, solid and unhurried. The way county courthouses in that part of Texas always look as if nothing happening in the town outside could surprise it. A high school football team whose Friday night games empty the town of everything else. A diner where the coffee arrives before you ask for it, and the same men sit in the same booths at the same hour every morning. It looks like one town. It has always been two. On one side of the tracks, the ranching families, the business owners, the people who run for county sheriff, and sit on the school board and serve on juries and make the decisions that shape what Tulia looks like from decade to decade. On the other side, across the tracks in the low-lying neighborhood, everyone calls the flats the black community. 300, maybe 400 people. Smaller, poorer. Its own churches, its own gathering places, its own long and particular memory of what it has meant to live in Tulia, Texas, across many sheriffs and many years. The two sides know each other the way these towns always do at the gas station, at the grocery checkout, at the hardware counter. A nod, a name. Two communities in the same zip code who have never quite sat at the same table. The flats had been shrinking for years before any of this happened. Quietly, gradually, development projects, zoning decisions, the kind of steady pressure that doesn't announce itself as displacement but accomplishes it anyway. Joe Moore had worked cattle and farmed and lived in Tulia his whole life. And he watched that pressure move across his neighborhood the way weather moves across the Panhandle, slow and certain, impossible to argue with. Houses coming down, families scattering, the boundary of his community pulling inward, block by block for 30 years in rooms he was never invited into. So when a stranger started showing up in the flats in early 1998, driving a beat-up truck, calling himself T.J. Dawson, saying he needed to score cocaine for his girlfriend Joe Moore, took one look and told everyone he knew, stay away from that man. He had seen enough in his life to know a cop when he saw one. The stranger's real name was Tom Coleman, and the trail he left behind him had not been hard to find for anyone who had thought to look. He was 40 years old in 1998, and he had moved between law enforcement jobs in several Texas counties without staying long in any of them. In Cochran County, where he had worked before, Tulia, a theft charge had been filed against him. He had used a county gas card to fill his personal vehicle, and his former boss had begun receiving letters from the local grocery store. The gas company, a mechanic, and half a dozen other vendors all asking for help, collecting money Coleman had promised to pay and hadn't. The charge was settled through a restitution arrangement quietly without going to trial. Not resolved. Buried. Sheriff Larry Stewart of Swisher County hired him anyway. He gave Coleman a budget of fake identity and an assignment to spend as much time as needed in Tulia's black community buying drugs. No wire, no partner, no supervisor checking his work against any independent standard. Just Coleman and his beat-up truck and a set of instructions that no one would be monitoring too closely. For the first 6 months he logged almost nothing. The people in the flats who actually moved drugs had made him for a cop before he said a word. They kept their distance. Joe Moore had made sure of that. So Coleman went to the edges to people who were isolated or struggling or dealing with their own drug problems and might not be entirely clear about what they had and hadn't done with the persistent stranger who kept showing up wanting to buy. He drove the flats in the evenings. He sat where people gathered. He worked his way slowly and patiently through a community that had no reason to trust him and no mechanism to remove him. He kept his records on his skin, names written in pen on the back of his hand, dates on his forearm, whatever surface was available when something needed to be noted, his written reports to the task force. The official documents that were supposed to justify his work were vague on dates, vague on locations, thin on the kind of detail that a real transaction would leave behind. Over 18 months he reported making more than 130 drug purchases from 46 different people. Almost every purchase was powdered cocaine, not crack, which was what the community he had infiltrated actually used, but powder which carried harsher federal sentencing guidelines. An unusually high percentage of the alleged transactions had taken place within 1,000 feet of a school or a park, a designation that elevated them to first-degree felonies. The sentences that designation could produce were not small. When Coleman's list was complete, Sheriff Stewart called the media. Camera crews were tipped off in advance. The arrests were going to be an event, and events needed an audience. The morning of July 23rd breaks the way July mornings break. In the Panhandle, the sun already full and pressing before 6 o'clock. The air dry and still, the town quiet in the particular way of towns that have not yet opened their eyes. Before the diner unlocks its door, before the first customer pulls into the hardware store lot, law enforcement fans out across the flats and starts knocking. Most of the 47 people are pulled from their beds. Some have time to pull on a shirt. Some do not. One by one they are walked to police vehicles and driven to the Swisher County Jail, and then one by one walked back out, half-dressed, disoriented, blinking into the Texas morning, and paraded down the street in front of the television cameras that are already running. The cameras were there before the first arrest. The sheriff made sure of that. Yule Bryant is 33 years old, a sales clerk at a store on the other side of town. He is still in his boxers when they knock. There is no time for anything else, and he comes to his front door that way and is handcuffed in his yard while the camera runs. He will say later that what struck him standing in the heat in his underwear while the lens pointed at him was how organized the whole thing was, how prepared. Not the chaos of a real investigation finally breaking open. Something more deliberate than that. As if the point was not just to arrest people, but to have them be seen being arrested. Freddie Brookins Jr. is 22 years old. His neighbors know him from the football field, the kind of young man a small town holds up as proof of itself, proof that if you work hard and stay clean and do the things you are supposed to do, this place will recognize you for it. He has no criminal record. The knock at his door before sunrise probably feels at first like a mistake. The kind of mistake that gets sorted out in an hour. He walks out into the heat with his hands behind his back. He will not be home for 4 years. The others follow. Joe Moore, who knew something like this was coming even if he could not have named its shape. Kizzy White, her brother. Cash Love, who is white and married to a black woman, which turns out to be sufficient connection to make Coleman's list. 47 people in total. 38 of them black in a town where the entire black adult population numbers somewhere between 300 and 400. Nearly 10%. Gone before breakfast. The Tulia Sentinel runs its headline before a single trial has been held, before a single piece of evidence has been presented in any courtroom. Tulia's streets cleared of garbage. The headline is written by a man named Michael Garrett. It is not ambiguous, it does not hedge, it does not wait. It reflects with an unusual directness what much of white Tulia feels looking out its windows and watching the cars pull away. Not discomfort, not skepticism, not the instinct to ask what evidence supports 47 arrests in a single morning. Something that sits in the chest and feels to the people who feel it a great deal like relief, like a long overdue accounting. Like justice finally arriving. That evening people gather at a church. They bow their heads. They fold their hands in their laps. They give thanks to God for what has been done. Tom Coleman is later named Outstanding Lawman of the Year by the Texas Attorney General. Gary Gardner sets the Sentinel down on his kitchen table and sits with it. He is a farmer from a village called Vigo Park, east of Tulia. A man whose family has worked Swisher County land for generations. He is by his own description a redneck. His vocabulary on race has not changed much since the 1950s, and he does not appear to notice. He is not a progressive. He voted against the school drug testing program years earlier, not out of principle, not because he had thought it through carefully, but because something about the whole business had not sat right with him. He had a farmer's instinct for when something is off, and that instinct had been running quietly ever since. He reads the headline. He looks at the list of names. He knows some of these people. Not well, they live across the tracks. His life and their lives don't cross much. But he has seen them around, at the gas station, in the parking lot. He knows that garbage is not what they are. He writes a letter to the district judge. Then he starts driving across town and knocking on doors, the doors of the families of those who were arrested, and sitting at kitchen tables and listening. A mother talking about her son. A wife talking about her husband. A father talking about a boy who played football and had no record and is now sitting in Swisher County Jail awaiting trial. His neighbors stop speaking to him. Not all at once, gradually, the way things shift in small towns. A conversation that ends a little earlier than it used to. An invitation that stops coming. A seat at the diner that is always occupied when he walks in. The people he has farmed alongside for 30 years who have helped him bring in the harvest when the weather turned bad look at him the way you look at someone who keeps raising a subject you have already decided not to discuss. He keeps asking anyway. Alan and Nancy Bean are there too. Charles and Patricia Kiker. A handful of others who cannot make the arithmetic work, cannot look at 47 arrests and 0 recovered grams and find a way to sit comfortably inside the prayer meeting. They form a group they call Friends of Justice. They reach out to the NAACP. They contact a small publication in Austin called the Texas Observer. A writer named Nate Blakesley drives to Tulia. He sits at kitchen tables for months. He goes through court records. He follows threads. The threads lead to Coleman's employment file from Cochran County, to the letters from the vendors asking for their money, back to the gas card, to the theft charge that was settled instead of prosecuted, and to something else, an outstanding warrant that existed against Coleman at the time of the Tulia trials. A warrant the Swisher County District Attorney Terry McEachin had known about since July 1999, the same month as the arrests. Coleman had testified under oath in trial after trial that he had never been arrested. McEachin knew that was a lie. McEachin said nothing. Blakesley's piece runs in the Texas Observer in June 2000. Jeff Blackburn, a civil rights attorney in Amarillo, reads it and begins filing appeals. Bob Herbert at the New York Times reads the appeals and writes a column he calls Kafka in Tulia. Then he writes another, then 11 more. The light, once it finds a crack, does not stop. The trials have been moving since late 1999. They move quickly. Each defendant stands before a jury that is nearly all white, in most trials one black juror, in some none. The state presents its case. The case is Coleman. Coleman takes the stand and says he purchased cocaine from this person on this date at this location. No recording exists of any transaction. No partner witnessed any of them. No physical evidence connects any defendant to any drug sale. Joe Moore goes first. His trial begins at 9 in the morning. By the following noon, the jury has returned its verdict. He is sentenced to 90 years. He is 59 years old and has worked cattle in Swisher County his whole life. Freddie Brookins is convicted of selling Coleman an 8-ball, roughly $80 worth of cocaine in a single transaction that no one else saw and no recording captured. He is sentenced to 20 years. The sentences stack: 45 years, 60, 99, 341. One defendant, Cash Love, receives 361 years for a series of alleged transactions, all of them witnessed only by Tom Coleman. None of them recorded, none of them corroborated. By the time the last trial ends, the combined prison time handed down to people convicted on the word of one man, in cases where not a single gram of drugs was recovered, exceeds 765 years. 765 years. The church where people gave thanks does not hold a second service to discuss this number. When the evidentiary hearings finally arrive, after the original judge is forced to recuse himself for writing a letter to a local newspaper defending his own record in the Coleman trials, a semi-retired judge from Dallas comes in to hear what Tom Coleman actually is. He listens to Coleman testify. He calls him the most devious, non-responsive law enforcement witness he has encountered in 25 years on the bench. He says Coleman's testimony is absolutely riddled with perjury. Among the things that come out in Coleman's wallet, investigators find a card identifying him as a member of the Ku Klux Klan. In a town where the entire black adult population numbers 300 or 400 people, 34 of the 38 convicted defendants are black. In 2003, Governor Rick Perry pardons 35 of the defendants. In 2005, Tom Coleman stands in a courtroom and is convicted of perjury. He is sentenced to probation. He does not spend a single night in prison. Sheriff Stewart, who hired him without checking his background, serves no time. District Attorney McEachin, who withheld evidence of Coleman's criminal record across trial after trial, serves no time. Judge Self, who presided over conviction after conviction built on a single man's word, serves no time. Freddie Brookins Jr. walks out of a Texas state prison. He has been gone 4 years. He is given no compensation. No check arrives. No formal acknowledgement from the county that took 4 years of his life on the word of a man whose notes were written on his legs. He goes back to Tulia. He lives there still. I do not think Tom Coleman is the story. He is comprehensible, a dishonest man in a system that rewarded dishonesty. A task force that received more funding for each arrest. It produced a sheriff who needed results and did not ask hard questions. Put all of that together and Coleman is almost inevitable. He is what that particular arrangement of incentives tends to produce. Finding him and punishing him inadequately and moving on, that is exactly how a town avoids the harder question. The harder question is the prayer meeting. The prayer meeting was not organized by Coleman. It was not suggested by the sheriff or the district attorney or the judge. It happened because people wanted to give thanks, and giving thanks felt like the right response, and the right response felt natural, and what makes it natural is the part that lives in Tulia long before Coleman drove his beat-up truck into the flats. Think about the person who wrote the headline, "Tulia's streets cleared of garbage." He has seen some of these 47 people around town. He knows at some level what the word garbage means and what it does not mean. He chooses it anyway, not out of cruelty, but out of something that feels to him like accuracy, like he is finally saying plainly what has always been true. Think about the people in that church. They are not, most of them, cruel people in the ways we usually mean. They go to church because they believe. They help their neighbors when the harvest is hard. They coach their children's sports teams. But they bow their heads over the 47 people who were walked in handcuffs down their main street. And what moves through them in that moment is not doubt. Not the question, was there enough evidence? What moves through them is relief. Something loosening in the chest. The feeling of a problem that has finally been addressed. What Gary Gardner's neighbors are protecting when they stop speaking to him is not Tom Coleman. Not a drug operation that produced not one recovered gram. They are protecting the story they have been telling themselves about their town. About which side of the tracks is the problem, about what kind of people live in the flats, about what justice looks like when it finally arrives. Gardner is not threatening Coleman. He is threatening the story. And the story is older and deeper and more load-bearing than any one man's guilt or innocence. That is what Coleman knew when he drove into Tulia. Not that he could fabricate 47 convictions out of nothing, but that the town already half believed the convictions before he opened his mouth. He didn't put that belief there. He found it sitting there patient and durable, and he used it. That is the part that does not get pardoned in 2003. The flats is mostly gone now. The development that was quietly consuming it before 1999 kept going after. Some of the families who were arrested never came back. Some returned and rebuilt what they could, which is not the same as what they had, because 4 years in a Texas prison for a crime that never happened is not the kind of thing a pardon reaches all the way into. Freddie Brookins passes the courthouse on his way to the grocery store. He passes the diner where the same men sit in the same booths at the same hour every morning. He passes the church where on the evening of the day he was arrested, people folded their hands and gave thanks. He carries what he carries. Gary Gardner got older. Some neighbors came back around eventually. Some did not. He went back to his land and kept working it the same Swisher County soil his family had always worked in, a county that had shown him that summer something about itself he had not known before and could not unknow. Nate Blakesley wrote a book. Jeff Blackburn practiced law in Amarillo until his health failed. The Friends of Justice disbanded. Bob Herbert left the Times. The story moved on the way stories always do when the cameras leave. What stays is the question that the prayer meeting raises, the one that is harder than anything a court can answer. Not what do we do about Tom Coleman. That has been handled inadequately, but formally. The question is, what does a community owe an honest accounting of itself? What does it cost to look back at that headline, at those bowed heads, at those 765 years handed to people on the word of a man writing names on his skin, and say plainly without qualification, we saw what we wanted to see? The people we called garbage were our neighbors, and we were wrong. Some communities find their way to that sentence. It takes a long time and it costs something real, and not everyone arrives. I don't know if Tulia has, but I think about Freddie Brookins walking out of that prison after 4 years, back into the same town, past the same courthouse, carrying something the pardon never touched. And I think about what it takes to come home to a place like that and stay, not because you have forgiven it, not because the debt has been paid, but because it is home. And home is the thing you carry whether you choose it or not. I think that takes more than most of us will ever be asked to give.